Chapter 1. The seal was already on my windowsill when I woke up. Black wax. No name. No sender. Just that deliberate stamp pressed into the dark. The same shape I had seen photographed in 3 missing persons reports I was never supposed to have access to. My hands did not shake when I picked it up. They went completely still, which was worse. I had 40 minutes before the transport arrived. I crushed the seal in my fist, dropped it into the trash, and pulled the bottle of fever root extract from behind my mattress. I had kept it there for 11 days since the second Omega disappeared, and I started doing the math nobody in the Capitol Bureau wanted anyone to do. 3 candidates. 3 black seals. 3 empty rooms with no signs of struggle and no forwarding addresses. The selection office called it nerves, called it cold feet, called it the kind of hysteria that made Omegas unreliable witnesses to their own lives. I drank the extract in 2 swallows. Tasted like copper and burned going down. Within 20 minutes, my temperature would climb to 103. My skin would flush. My scent would go sharp and wrong, the biological signal of contagion that made every alpha in proximity take 3 steps back without understanding why. I climbed back into bed, pulled the sheets up to my chin, and called Nurse Briar Calloway at the boarding house clinic. She answered on the second ring. I said 7 words. She said nothing for 4 full seconds, then told me she would be there in 10 minutes and that I should not open the door for anyone else. I stared at the ceiling while I waited. The morning was pale gray outside the narrow window above my bed. New Carthage never got real sunlight this time of year, just this weak silver light that sat on top of everything like a warning. I could hear the street below coming alive, the early transport vehicles, the vendors setting up their carts, the quiet shuffle of Omegas in their formal candidate attire moving toward the selection hall 2 blocks east. I had sewn my candidate sash 2 months ago. It was folded on the chair beside my desk, pressed and perfect, useless. Briar arrived in 9 minutes. She took one look at my face, closed the door behind her, and pressed her fingers to my wrist to check my pulse. Her expression did not change, but her grip tightened for just 1 second. She said, quietly, that she would file the report as blood fever onset. She said the selection bureau would be notified before the first roll call. She pulled out her tablet and began typing before I could thank her. Then she stopped typing, and without looking up, she said something I have not stopped thinking about since. She said, "If he comes himself, do not tell him what I saw." I asked her who. She did not answer. She finished the report, checked my temperature, noted it on her intake form, and left without explaining. I listened to her footsteps go down the hall. I listened to the building go quiet. I lay in the heated dark of my own manufactured illness and told myself that I had made the right decision. That surviving the selection meant nothing if surviving it got me killed anyway. That whatever the black seal meant, I was better off invisible. I was still telling myself that when the wolves in the alley below my window stopped howling. They had been going since 4 in the morning, low and rhythmic, the kind of sound that meant something moving through the territory that outranked everything else in the block. I had tuned it out. Now the silence hit harder than the sound ever had. Every alpha biological signal in that alley had just stood down. My door opened. Not knocked. Opened. The lock had not been forced. It simply gave like it had always meant to. He filled the frame without trying to. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in something dark and plain that did nothing to hide the authority sitting in every line of his body. No crown. No formal seal. No soldiers visible, though I knew without looking that they were positioned in the hallway behind him. His scent reached me before he took another step, and my body reacted before I gave it permission to. Winter and iron and something under both of those things, something warmer than either, like heat held inside stone. His eyes moved across the room with the precision of someone cataloging details rather than admiring them. They landed on me and stayed. He said, "You were warned not to attend." I could not breathe. He crossed to the chair beside my bed, the one with the unused candidate sash still folded on it, and he moved the sash aside without comment and sat down like he had done it 100 times before. He looked at the fever root flush on my skin. He looked at the trash can near the window. He looked back at me. He did not reach for me. He did not raise his voice. He folded his hands in his lap and studied my face with the kind of patience that felt like a slow pressure. Not a threat, but a certainty. The certainty that he had no plans to leave until I gave him something true. He said, "Whoever threatened you knew your candidate number before the roster was published." That information came from inside the selection office. I stared at him. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the nightstand beside me. Another black wax seal, already broken, with my name written on the inside in ink that had no scent at all. He read the words on the inner surface aloud. 2 words below my name, written in a hand I did not recognize. Final Vessel, Chapter 2. I did not move for a long time after he said it. Final Vessel. The words sat in the air between us like something physical, like something that had weight and edge. My mind kept reaching for a rational explanation and finding nothing. Seals did not carry writing inside them. That was not how they worked. The wax was pressed as a mark, a signal, a territorial brand with no interior surface meant to hold text. Whatever process had put those words inside that seal had not followed any method I had ever been trained to read. He was still watching me. Not impatiently, just watching like a man who had learned long ago that silence pulled more truth out of people than pressure ever could. I said, "How did you open it?" He said, "I did not. It opened when it was placed beside yours." I thought about that for 3 seconds and then made the decision to not let it terrify me yet. There was a sequence to surviving a situation like this one, and falling apart came later, privately, when there was no one watching. I sat up in the bed and pulled the sheets back from my legs, trying to look less like someone performing an illness and more like someone who had a right to ask him questions. The fever-root heat was still moving through me. My skin felt too tight. His scent was not helping. I said, "Why did you come yourself?" He said, "Because the people I sent last night did not come back." The room went very quiet. Not metaphorically quiet. Actually quiet, the way a space goes still when information lands in it that changes the shape of everything. He said it plainly, without theater, the way someone reports a fact they have already processed and moved past. 2 of his people had gone into the field the night before. They had not returned. He had come himself because sending a third seemed like a poor use of a life. I asked him what he thought the seal meant. He said he had a theory, but he was not going to share it with someone who was still deciding whether to trust him. That was a fair thing to say. It was also an irritating thing to say because it was correct. I was doing exactly that. I had been doing it since he walked through the door, cataloging everything, the plainness of his clothes, the absence of formal seals on his person, the way he had set the broken wax beside me rather than holding it over me. He had made every choice available to a person who wanted to seem safe. I could not tell yet whether those choices came from strategy or character. He said, "Your scent shifts when you are reading someone. Did you know that?" I said nothing. He said it was not a criticism. He said most people with rare scent ability had tells, involuntary biological responses that accompanied active reading. He said he found it useful, actually. He said he would rather negotiate with someone who was genuinely trying to assess the situation than someone performing compliance. I said, "You came here because you knew the selection was a trap." He did not answer right away. He looked at the window, then at the trash can again, then back at me. He said the selection had been running clean for 11 years. He said it stopped running clean 14 months ago, around the time Mercer Kane was appointed security minister. He said 3 Omegas with rare blood designations had vanished without forensic traces, which was not a statistical accident. It was a method. He said my scent designation had been flagged in the candidate database 4 months ago. I said, "Flagged by whom?" He said, "By someone who wanted to make sure you were selected before anyone else could pull you from the pool." My chest went cold. For months ago, I had not yet decided to submit a candidate application. I had been considering it the way you consider things you do not want to do but believe you probably should, because the alternative is worse. The application had gone in 10 weeks ago. Someone had known I would apply before I knew myself. He watched the calculation move through my face. He did not rush me through it. When I came out the other side, he said, "The illness is good. Not medically convincing, but good enough to buy time." He said I should maintain it for as long as I needed. He said he would have the boarding house flagged as a quarantine site, which would keep bureau representatives from making follow-up visits without his clearance. He said, "Pretend to be sick as long as you need. I will wait. But while I wait, you will decide whether you want to die with your secret or live long enough to use it." I looked at him for a long time. The morning light had shifted while we talked, moving from pale gray to something almost white, cold and flat against the window. His face in that light was very still. Not empty. Still. The way deep water looks still when you cannot see the bottom. I said, "You are not here to choose me." He said, "No." I said, "You are here because you already know I am in danger and you need what I can do." He said, "Both of those things are true." He said he was not going to pretend otherwise. That honesty was the first thing about him that made me lower my guard by a fraction. Not because it was kind, because it was expensive. A man who wanted to manipulate me would have told me I was precious to him. He had told me I was useful and endangered, and those were two things I could verify. I was still sitting with that when I noticed the thing I should have noticed 10 minutes earlier. The broken seal on my nightstand had no scent. Not diminished scent. Not mask scent. 0 scent. Wax that had been handled, transported, and broken by at least one person should have carried biological trace from every hand that touched it. This seal was clean as a surgical instrument. I looked up at him. His eyes had not moved from my face. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small case, opened it, and showed me 3 other seals, each broken, each carrying a name I recognized from the missing persons list. He turned them over in his palm, and on the inside of each one, in the same scentless ink, were 2 words. Every single one said the same thing. Final Vessel. Chapter 3. He moved me before dawn. I did not pack much. He told me to take what I could carry in one bag, nothing with my candidate number on it, nothing from the Bureau's issued materials, nothing that would create a paper trail connecting Sairen Holt to wherever I was going. I took my scent record case, my personal tablet, a change of clothes, and the photograph I kept tucked inside the back cover of my field manual. He did not ask what the photograph was of. I did not explain. Breyer met us in the service corridor on the ground floor. She had already altered the quarantine report to list my condition as progressing and my location as confirmed in isolation. She handed him a copy of the updated file and did not look at me while she did it. When I touched her arm on the way past, she finally met my eyes. She said, "Be careful who you read in there." Then she stepped back into the clinic door and closed it, and I did not see her again for 5 days. The palace's recovery wing was nothing like the selection hall I had always imagined. It was not ceremonial. It had no gilding, no formal seals on the walls, none of the symbolic weight I had been taught to associate with royal space. It was clean and white and very quiet, with high ceilings that made every sound feel far away. They put me in a room at the east end, corner-facing, 2 windows that looked out over an internal garden that nobody seemed to use. There was a camera above the door and another above the window. Both were visible. Neither was hidden. I cataloged them in the first 4 minutes the way you catalog threats, quickly and without expression. The first person who visited me was not him. Security Minister Mercer Kane arrived at 11 that morning, dressed impeccably in the Bureau's formal gray, carrying a small tray with tea I did not drink. He was somewhere in his early 50s, handsome in a deliberate way, the kind of man who had spent decades making sure his face conveyed exactly the right amount of warmth at exactly the right moments. He set the tray on the table beside the window, and he smiled at me with all the right muscles. He said, "The king can be impulsive when he finds something interesting." He said this gently, the way you say something gentle when you want it to feel like concern and function like a warning. He said the king had a history of bringing in omegas from difficult situations and creating the impression of protection that was actually a form of collection. He said I should not read too much into the attention. He said I should remember that attention from powerful alphas had a shelf life. I sat in the chair across from him and kept my face very neutral. I was reading him. I could not stop myself. His scent had been worked on, pressed down, reduced to almost nothing, which was not impossible to do but was expensive and intentional. The medical process that suppressed a scent signature to that degree was not something people did casually. You did it because you needed to move through spaces without being read. You did it because your natural signature was something you could not afford to have anyone detect. I said, that is very helpful information. He smiled again. He said he hoped my recovery was quick and comfortable. He said he would have the Wings medical team check in regularly. He said to let him know if I needed anything at all. He left. I listened to his footsteps go down the corridor, even and unhurried, and I waited until I could not hear them any more before I exhaled. His scent had been scrubbed clean. But for 3 seconds when he leaned across to set down the tray, close enough that my reading ability functioned at full depth, I had caught something underneath the scrubbing. Not his scent. A trace on his glove. A thread of someone else's biological signature. Faint as old paper. Half dissolved by whatever chemical process he used on himself. I knew that scent. I had been trained on it. I had memorized it from shared housing and borrowed jackets and the particular warmth of a person who had grown up 2 streets from me and disappeared 6 weeks ago without a note, without a trace, without anything except the memory of a conversation he had tried to have with me that I had not taken seriously in time. Callum Vyer's scent was on Mercer Kane's glove. I sat very still in the white room with the 2 cameras and the garden nobody used, and I put that fact somewhere inside myself where my face could not reach it. He came that evening. Not as the king. He arrived in plain clothes, dark pants and a gray thermal. No formal insignia. Carrying food from the building's staff kitchen rather than the formal dining service. He set it on the small table beside the window and pulled up the second chair without asking. He said nothing while I ate. He did not watch me in a way that felt like surveillance. He watched the garden through the window, and after a while he said there had been a white bird in that garden for 3 years and nobody on staff could identify the species. He said the botanist who maintained the grounds had tried twice to document it, and both times the bird had simply not been there when the camera was aimed at it. I looked at him. He was not making conversation. He was telling me something about the quality of attention this place paid to things that did not want to be found. Under the table, my hand pressed flat against my leg to keep it from shaking, because scratched into the paint on the underside of the table, in letters too small to see without knowing to look, in handwriting I had known since childhood, were 6 words. We are alive beneath the selection hall. Chapter 4. I told him. Not immediately. Not easily. I sat with those 6 words for 2 full minutes, my hand still pressed flat to my leg, my face held carefully in place, and I ran through every reason not to say anything. I was in his house. His cameras were above both doors. Mercer Kane was somewhere in this building with Callum's scent on his hands and no viable explanation for how it got there. And Torvian Ardent was sitting 3 feet from me, watching a bird that refused to be documented. And I had no way yet to know which side of that equation he actually occupied. But Callum had written those words for someone to find. And I was the someone who had found them. I said, there is something written under this table. He did not reach for the table. He looked at me. I said, in handwriting I recognize. From someone who has been listed as a voluntary withdrawal from the candidate pool for 6 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he wanted to show me something, and he asked if I was willing to come with him tonight, after the corridor cameras cycled at midnight. He said the footage gap lasted 11 minutes. He said it had been the same gap every night for 4 months, and that he had noticed it and said nothing because he had been waiting for a reason to use it. I said, you have a hidden room. He said, I have a hidden map room. He said there was a difference. At 12 minutes past midnight, he came back in plain clothes with 2 small lights clipped to his collar, and he led me through a service door at the end of the east wing that opened onto a stairwell that did not appear on any architectural layout I had ever processed in my bureau work. We went down 2 floors. The walls changed from painted plaster to raw stone, and then to something older than the stone, brick that had been laid before the current building existed, part of whatever had occupied this land before the Capitol Bureau redesigned it. The map room was a single low-ceilinged space about the size of a generous bedroom. Every surface had something on it. Tables with physical maps, some printed, some hand-drawn, some combinations of both with annotations in 4 different handwriting styles. Scent record files in sealed cases stacked along one wall. Missing persons documentation, not the official versions, the raw data, the versions that existed before the selection office formatted them for public consumption. Photographs, timelines, A string board on the far wall with names connected by lines of different colors, and at the center of it, a shape I recognized. The same stamp as the black wax seal. He stood behind me and let me look. He did not guide me through it. He let me read the room the way I read a scent, moving through it until the pattern assembled itself. I said, "You have been investigating this for 14 months. He said, "Yes." I said, "Every formal inquiry was blocked." He said, "Every single one." He said the blocks came from the Security Ministry's office within 48 hours of each request. He said he had stopped filing formal inquiries 8 months ago because each one put the missing candidates at greater risk by signaling that someone with authority was getting close. I said, "So you have been working around your own government?" He said, "I have been working around one specific part of it." I turned to look at him directly. In the low light of the map room, his face was different than it had been in my boarding house room or in the recovery wing above. Something in him was less controlled here, not unstable, just less managed. Like a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally reached a table where they could set it down. He said his father had used the selection for 20 years as a political instrument. Match the right Omega to the right noble family, build the right alliance, stabilize the right border dispute. He said when he inherited the selection process, he had sworn he would not do that. He said he had been naive enough to believe that swearing it was enough. I looked back at the string board, at the center shape. I said, "The seal reacts to specific scent signatures." He said, "We believe so." I said, "And whoever is taking these candidates is looking for a specific biological profile." He said, "A rare blood Omega with active scent reading ability. The kind that can detect altered bonds and corrupted bloodline markers at close range." I looked at the cases along the wall, sealed, labeled with codes rather than names. I said, "How many cases?" He said, 11 confirmed. He said he believed there were more that had never been flagged because the candidates were pulled before their selection numbers were registered. 11 people. 11 people moved through whatever machinery sat beneath the selection hall, and the official record showed nothing but quiet departures and unforwarded mail. I opened the case nearest to me and pulled the top file. The scent record inside was partial, pulled from a pre-selection processing sheet. I read it the way I had been trained to read, actively, with my full ability engaged, and the profile assembled itself clearly. Then I pulled the second file. Read it. The third. The fourth. By the 8th, I understood something that turned the temperature in the room down by several degrees. All 8 Omegas had the same secondary marker in their scent profile. An obscure genetic tag that showed up in less than 2% of all Omega biological designations. A tag associated historically with the old royal bloodline documentation that had been sealed and officially classified as archival myth 40 years ago. I had that tag. I had known about it since my first biological assessment at 17. I had been told it was a statistical curiosity with no clinical significance. I set the 8th file down and looked at the string board. My hands were steady. I said, "Someone is building something. These candidates are not trophies. They are components." He said nothing. He watched me arrive at it. I picked up the seal from the case at the center of the board. It was a copy sealed in evidence casing. I held it at the edge of the case, close enough to read without breaking containment, and I engaged my ability fully, pulling every trace available through the barrier. The seal was not just wax. There were compounds inside it, pressed into the molecular structure at a depth that would not show under standard forensic analysis. Sedative herb derivatives, bonding suppressant compounds, and underneath both of those, something organic, something biological that did not belong to any plant compound I had ever cataloged. It belonged to a person. The seal carried royal blood. I put the case down. My heart was beating at a pace that I was working hard not to show. And then, from above us, I heard the seal on the map room door engage from the outside. The room locked, and from the ventilation seam near the ceiling, the air changed. Chapter 5. The air went wrong before I could name what was in it. Sweet in the wrong way, the way something sweet becomes a signal rather than a comfort, when the biology in you that predates language starts firing before your mind has finished processing the input. My eyes went to the ventilation seam. A faint shimmer near the grate, something fine and dispersed moving through the cold air, invisible in the low light except for the way it caught the edge of one of the map table lamps. He was already moving. Not toward the door. Toward me. He stepped between me and the vent without explaining why, and the gesture was so instinctive, so without theater, that my body registered it as significant before I decided it was. He put one hand to the stone wall beside the grate and pressed, and I heard something release in the masonry, a latch built into the original brick, something older than the current structure. He said, "Hold your breath and stay close." I held it. He moved through the gap in the wall that appeared where the latch had been, and I followed him into a passage so narrow our shoulders nearly touched on both sides. He sealed the gap behind us from the inner surface, and then the passage curved left and descended, and the air here was different, dry and old and completely still, nothing moving in it. I exhaled and breathed carefully. The passage ended at a flat wall with a single iron ring. He pulled it. A door, so well fitted into the stone that I had not seen the seam, swung inward, and beyond it was a small service room with a utility sink and a broken chair and a ceiling light that flickered twice when he found the switch and then held. He checked the door seal behind us. He checked the ceiling. He checked both corners. Then he sat on the floor with his back to the wall, pulled his knees up, and breathed out slowly. I stood in the center of the room and let the panic I had been holding move through me in one controlled wave and then pulled it back under. He looked up at me. He said, "The compound in the vent is a dissociative sedative. Airborne. It works in about 4 minutes of exposure at that concentration." He said he had found traces of it in the ventilation testing reports from 7 months ago and had flagged it to maintenance. He said maintenance had filed a repair confirmation 3 days later. He said the clearance code used to activate the vent system tonight was registered to his account. That landed exactly the way it was meant to. Whoever had locked the map room and opened the gas line had done it with Torvian's own security credentials, which meant someone with access to his palace account had used it against him. In his own building. I sat down on the floor across from him. My legs were working, but I did not feel the need to perform composure anymore. The room was small and cold and entirely honest, which was more than I could say for most of the spaces I had occupied in the last 48 hours. He said, "I need to tell you something." He said he was not going to ask me to trust him. He said trust was earned through time and action, and he had given me neither in adequate supply yet. But he said there were things I needed to know to stay alive, and he was going to tell me regardless of whether it changed how I looked at him. I said, "Then tell me." He said the security footage from the map room maintenance access had been accessed 11 days ago by an account registered to someone on his household staff. He said he had been watching that account since. He said tonight's activation had come from a secondary device he had not been able to trace yet. I said, "Someone inside this building is feeding information outward." He said, "Yes." I said, "And they know we were both in that room tonight." He said, "Yes." I looked at the floor between us. There was old stone dust on it, pale gray, undisturbed for what looked like months. Nobody came here. Nobody knew this room existed. For right now, that was the only currency we had. I said, "I need to tell you something too." He waited. I told him about Callum. Not the scrubbed version. Not the abbreviated version I had been keeping compressed inside my chest since the recovery wing. I told him about the boarding house 2 streets over from where I grew up. I told him about the phone call I had gotten 6 weeks before Callum disappeared, the one where he told me the selection was being used to move people, that he had heard something in a processing session that scared him badly enough to call me at 2 in the morning. I told him that I had told Callum he was being paranoid, that I had told him to stop reading conspiracy threads and sleep, that I had hung up and gone back to sleep myself and not called him back. He was missing 4 days later, and I had been carrying the weight of that call every single day since. He did not tell me it was not my fault. He did not offer me comfort language. He sat with what I had told him and let it be true, which was the only thing I actually needed. Then he said, quietly, that Callum's call was not the first. He said there had been 2 other candidates in the months prior who had tried to report concerns through official channels. He said both reports had been rerouted to the security ministry. He said neither candidate had been seen publicly after that. My throat closed. I pressed my hand flat against the stone floor. He said, You are not responsible for a system that was designed to make warning impossible. I said nothing for a long time. The light above us flickered once. Held. Then I said something I had not planned to say. I said, I want you. And I heard myself say it and felt the absolute cold terror of having said it, because wanting something that could be taken from you was the most dangerous position available. I said, that is what scares me. Everyone who gets close to me disappears. He looked at me across the stone floor. He did not move quickly. He reached across the space between us and his hand came to rest beside mine. Not on top of it, not claiming it, just present, just there. He said, then I will be the one who stays visible. When we finally moved, when he found the secondary exit through the service level and got us both back to the recovery wing before the camera cycle resumed, I was steady on my feet. I was functional. I was operating. But when the door to my room closed behind me and I was alone, I stood in the center of the white floor and let myself understand what had just happened. Briar had given me a warning I had not understood in time. She had said, if he comes himself, do not tell him what you saw. And I had assumed she meant the seal. I had assumed she meant the threat. I pressed my back against the wall and slid down to the floor, because the security footage timestamp from the map room activation had been on the screen of the utility display in the service passage, visible for exactly 3 seconds as we passed it. The activation timestamp was from 4 hours before we entered the room. Someone had known we would be in that room before we decided to go. Chapter 6. Someone had known we would be in that room before we decided to go. I sat on the floor of my recovery room and held that fact still inside me like a blade I was afraid to pull out too fast. The timestamp, for hours prior, before Torvian had even come to my room that evening, before he had suggested the map room at all. Someone had pre-activated the vent system and locked the door on a schedule, not on surveillance, not in real-time response to our movement. On a schedule, which meant they had predicted the sequence. They had known he would take me there. They had known it before he did, which meant one of two things. Either someone was reading Torvian's decisions before he made them, which pointed to someone with access to his private communications, his habits, his thinking patterns, or the map room visit had not been Torvian's idea at all. It had been the destination someone else had built the evening toward, using information as bait, placing me and him in exactly the position they needed us in. I did not sleep. By 6 in the morning I had written out the logic in my field notebook in a cipher I had developed at 17 and never taught to anyone. By 7 I had burned the page in the utility sink and watched the ash go down the drain. By 8, when the building started moving with its morning routines, I was dressed and sitting in the chair facing the door with my scent record case open on the table and every file I had memorized from the map room laid out in order in my head. He came at 8:40. He looked like he had not slept either, which was the first thing about him that felt genuinely human to me rather than architecturally controlled. He had a coffee in each hand and he set one on the table beside my case without asking whether I wanted it. I picked it up. He said, Silas was on the original tunnel access list from 14 months ago. I set the coffee down. He said his younger half-brother's name had appeared in the building access logs from the sub-level maintenance corridors, the same corridors that ran directly beneath the selection hall's foundation. He said the entry record was logged under a routine inspection clearance, which would not have flagged during a standard security review. He said he had found it only because he had been manually cross-referencing every sub-level entry for the past 3 months. I said, you did not confront him. He said no. I said, why? He said, because the moment I confront someone inside this building, whoever is watching from outside knows exactly how close I am. That was a clean answer. It was also the kind of answer that kept itself useful by staying 2 steps back from full disclosure. I filed that. I told him about the timestamp. All of it directly the way I had processed it through the night. I watched his face while I spoke, and what I saw there was not surprise. It was confirmation. He had already suspected the map room visit had been guided. He had not known how to prove it without access to the ventilation system's internal log, which required security ministry clearance he could not request without tipping the very person he suspected. He said, I need your ability, not the way the Bureau used it. I need you to read the building. I asked what that meant. He said, Every person in this wing has been processed through standard scent filtering on entry. It removes surface traces, personal identifiers, biological markers that could be used to track them. But filtering has a ceiling. At full reading depth, you can detect what the filter was applied over, the shape of what was removed. I said, "You want me to read your staff?" He said, "I want you to read one specific person." He said Briar Calloway had submitted her clinic credentials to the Bureau's medical staffing pool 11 months ago. He said her previous employer, the institution listed on her application, had no record of her working there. He said the credential verification had been processed and approved in 48 hours, which was 3 times faster than the standard review timeline. I said, "She warned me not to tell you what I saw." He said, "I know." The morning moved. He arranged for Briar to come to the recovery wing under a routine medical check. I sat in the corner chair with my case open like I was reviewing files. She came in at 10:20, and she was good. She was very good. Her movements were practiced and calm, her professional warmth exactly calibrated, her eye contact steady and unhurried. But she came close enough to check my temperature, and I read her at full depth, and what I found underneath the surface filter was not a medical professional signature. It was the chemical residue of the same bonding suppressant compound I had found in the black wax seal. Not a trace, pattern. The kind of sustained exposure that built up over months of regular contact with the compound. She had been working with it consistently, handling it, preparing it. She had not warned me away from Torvian because she wanted to protect me. She had warned me because keeping me isolated from him served whatever operation she was part of. I looked at her. She looked at me. And in the space of 1 second, something in her face shifted, the way a performance shifts when the performer realizes the audience already knows the ending. She said, quietly, that she had not wanted anyone hurt. She said it like a person who had run out of other options and was down to the truth. She said she had worked in Mercer Kane's medical unit for 3 years before she came here. She said she had helped seal 1 Omega into the sublevel holding system and had lived with that knowledge every single day since. She said she had taken the clinic position to find a way to undo it. She said she had been feeding information back to Mercer because he had something of hers that she could not afford to lose. She said the missing Omegas were alive. She said they were not beneath the selection hall. She said they were beneath us, right now, beneath this building. Then from somewhere below the floor of the recovery wing, faint and structured, came 3 deliberate knocks. Chapter 7. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. Not random, not pipes settling or mechanical noise finding its rhythm. 3, pause, 3, the pattern Callum and I had used as children to signal through walls when we did not want adults to hear us. A code that existed between exactly 2 people in the world and had never been written down anywhere. My body moved before my mind authorized it. I was on my knees beside the floor before I understood that I had crossed the room, pressing both palms flat against the tile, trying to feel the direction, the depth, the distance. The knocking stopped. The floor was cold and gave nothing back. Briar said, "East sublevel. 3rd corridor from the interior wall." She said it quietly, with the precision of someone who had memorized a layout they were not supposed to have seen. Torvian was already at the door, checking the corridor. He came back in, closed it, looked at Briar with the full weight of his authority and none of its theater, and said she was going to take us there and she was going to do it right now. She said, "If Mercer finds out I helped you access that corridor, he will release the footage he has of me from 3 years ago." She said it would end her. She said the Omega she had helped seal into the system had been conscious and aware, and she had done it anyway because Mercer had been holding her younger sister's welfare contract since the girl was 16. Torvian said, "I will break the contract. Today. Before we go down." He said it the way he said most things, without performance, without bargaining margin. He said it like a fact that had already happened. Briar looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. The passage to the east sublevel came through a decommissioned laundry corridor 2 floors below the recovery wing. It was not on the building schematics that had been filed with the Capitol Bureau. It was on the original construction drawings from 43 years prior, before the renovation that had folded the old structure into the palace's east expansion. Briar moved through it without a light, which told me she had walked it more than once. The corridor widened at the third junction. The walls here were different, newer than the stone above, and the smell was wrong. Medical wrong. Antiseptic layered over something organic, the kind of chemical combination that appeared in long-term holding facilities where biological monitoring was continuous. She stopped at a door with a coded panel and entered a sequence from memory. The door opened inward. The room beyond was large and very cold and lit with the kind of flat white lighting that had no warmth in it at all. There were 8 beds, each occupied, each person connected to a monitoring line that measured temperature and sent output and suppressed both at adjustable thresholds. Every person in the room was alive. Every person in the room was an Omega I recognized from the missing persons documentation in the map room. And at the bed closest to the door, sitting upright and watching the entrance with eyes that had not yet decided whether to believe what they were seeing, was Callum Vire. He looked thinner. He looked like someone who had spent 6 weeks in artificial light with no real air and too much time inside their own head. But his eyes were sharp and his hands were steady, and when he saw me he said my name once, low and flat, like he was testing whether his voice still worked. I crossed to him. I sat on the edge of his bed. I held his face in my hands and checked his pupils and his color and his sense signature at depth. Everything functional, everything intact, suppressed but not damaged. He gripped my wrist and said, "Do not let the king mark you." I went still. He said, "That is what they are building toward." He said the sublevel system was not just a holding facility. It was a collection process. He said Mercer needed a complete set of rare blood Omega scent profiles to run a specific bonding ceremony, an old ritual from the sealed royal documents that required the biological convergence of multiple rare signatures to activate a blood mark transfer. He said the transfer would allow someone to rewrite a royal bonding record, to insert a false mate claim into the biological registry at the cellular level, so deep that no standard test could detect the forgery. He said the final component of the transfer required the king's own mark. Freely given or taken. Either worked for the ritual's purposes. He said Mercer did not want to destroy Torvian. He wanted to own him. A forged bond at the cellular level would give Mercer's chosen designate a legal and biological claim to the throne that even Torvian's own body would eventually accept as true. I stood up. I looked at Torvian across the room. He had heard everything. His face was controlled in the way it always was, but underneath the control something was burning. I said, "They needed me here. They moved me into this building for a reason." He said, "Yes." I said, "Because my sense signature is the final profile they needed for the convergence set." He said, "Yes." I said, "And the attraction between us. The pull. The way my biology responded to him from the first moment." Torvian said nothing. He did not look away. Callum said the seals were not threats. They were preparation. They were designed to prime your biological response to his specific alpha signature before you ever met. They seeded the reaction. Mercer needed you wanting him before the ritual so that your scent output during the mark event would read as willing. The room went very quiet. Everything I had felt since that first morning. Every lowered guard. Every moment of trust building toward something I had chosen freely. I looked at the man across the room who had sat beside my bed and said he would stay visible. And I could not tell anymore where the engineered response ended and the real one began. Chapter 8. I walked out of the sublevel without speaking to him. Not because I believed the worst. Because I could not yet afford to believe anything. And moving was the only way I knew to keep the panic from taking the wheel. Callum's words were inside me, working through every memory I had made in this building, every moment I had catalogued as real. The bedside visit, the map room, the stone floor of the service room, and his hand placed beside mine without claiming it. The words he had said. I replayed each one looking for the seam where genuine ended and constructed began, and the problem, the genuinely terrifying problem, was that I could not find it. Because either it was all constructed so well that even full-depth reading could not detect the manipulation, which would make Torvian the most dangerous person I had ever met, or none of it was constructed and Callum's information, accurate about the ritual, accurate about the seals, was wrong about the man. I needed the forged file to be forged. I needed to run the test I had the ability to run. I went back to the recovery wing. I opened my scent record case. I pulled the broken seal that Torvian had placed on my nightstand on the first morning, the one he had brought as evidence, the one I had not yet read at full depth because the situation had moved too fast. I read it now. Everything. Every compound layered into the wax. Every trace of biological material pressed into the structure at depth. The sedative compounds were there. The bonding suppressant was there. And the third layer, the one I had identified as organic, as belonging to a person rather than a plant derivative, I read it all the way down this time, past the surface identification, past the category, down to the specific signature. It was not Torvian's blood in the seal. It was Mercer Kane's. The seals had not been created by the king's office. They had been created using Mercer's own biological material, pressed into a ritual structure that Mercer had been building for longer than the 14 months Torvian had been investigating. This was not a response to Torvian's attention toward Omegas. This had been running before Torvian even took the throne. Mercer had not been trying to forge a bond to steal the throne. He had been building toward something older and larger than that, something that required not just a forged mark but a complete biological rewrite of the royal bloodline record going back 3 generations. I needed the archive. I needed the sealed royal documents that Callum had referenced. I needed the original ritual specification so I could read what the final convergence actually produced and who it actually benefited. I went looking for them. The palace archive was 4 floors above the recovery wing, in a sealed reading room that required identity verification at the door. I had no clearance. What I had was my sense signature, which the building's oldest biometric locks, the ones installed before the digital renovation, responded to differently than the newer systems. Old locks read pure biology. My rare blood designation had a tag that the original royal architects had built into the palace's recognition matrix because Omegas with that tag had historically held advisory access in the pre-bureau era. The archive door opened for me. Inside, the sealed royal documents were physical, not digital, stored in flat cases along the north wall. I found the ritual specification in the 3rd case. It was written in archival script that I could read because Bureau-sent record training included historical document literacy for cross-referencing old bonding records. I read it in 11 minutes. Then I sat down on the archive floor because my legs gave out from under me. The ritual did not transfer a bond to a false mate. The ritual revealed a hidden bond that already existed, a bond that had been suppressed and buried in the bloodline record by whoever had sealed these documents 40 years ago. The convergence of rare blood-scent profiles did not forge anything. It authenticated. It acted as a biological key that unlocked whatever the original record actually said. And the original record, the one that the sealing had been designed to hide, listed an Omega bloodline as co-equal in the royal succession. Not advisory, not consort, co-equal, governing. The Omega line had been written out of the official record and the sealing had been the mechanism. Someone 40 years ago had taken an entire bloodline's legal standing and buried it under classified documentation and told every generation after that it was archival myth. Mercer was not trying to steal the throne. He was trying to prevent the Omega line from being authenticated. He was taking candidates with the rare blood tag because each one who disappeared made the convergence set impossible to complete. No convergence, no authentication, no record unlock. He was not hunting us to use us. He was hunting us to stop us from existing in sufficient number. I pressed both hands against the archive floor and breathed. Then above me, the reading room door opened, and the lights came on at full strength, and Mercer Kane walked in with 4 bureau security officers behind him and his expression carrying the particular flatness of a man who had just run out of patience. He looked at the open case on the floor beside me. He looked at my face. He said very quietly that this was going to be considerably more public than he had intended. He told the officers to bring me to the selection court. Chapter 9. The selection court was full. Not ceremonially full, the way it looked on processional days with arranged seating and formal attire and every angle managed for the broadcast record. Full in the way a space fills when word moves faster than official channels, when people in a building sense that something real is about to happen and they come to watch it happen whether or not they were invited. Staff, nobles, ministry representatives, bureau delegates, and at the back near the east entrance, 3 members of the palace press corps with their recording equipment already running. Mercer had wanted witnesses. He had called them here before he came to find me. This had been the plan all along, once he realized I had reached the archive. He had let me run because an Omega caught with sealed documents in an unauthorized space was a better story than an Omega dragged from a recovery room. He had given me the rope and the room and then simply waited for me to use both. They walked me to the center of the floor. The stone seal was beneath my feet, the old royal mark inlaid into the original construction. The same shape as the black wax stamps, larger than I had expected, detailed in a way that the smaller versions had only suggested. I could feel it through the soles of my shoes, a faint warmth that made no physical sense given the cold of the room. Mercer addressed the court. He did not raise his voice. He was extraordinarily good at making authority sound like reason. He said an Omega candidate held under quarantine in the recovery wing had been found in the classified archive after bypassing identity verification protocols. He said the candidate had a documented history of unauthorized access to Bureau internal records. He said the candidate had gained proximity to the Alpha King through manufactured illness and fabricated medical distress and had used that proximity to extract classified intelligence from the palace map room. He paused. He looked at me. He said I had come to the capital not as a candidate but as an operative working against the interests of the royal succession. The room went very still. He said there was documentation. He said there was corroborating testimony from a clinic nurse who had helped me gain illegal access to the quarantine system. He said the evidence was complete and the appropriate response was immediate removal of my candidate status, formal bureau detention, and a full investigation into any intelligence I had transferred and to whom. He said it cleanly and completely and with the kind of confidence that came from having built a case out of enough real facts that the false structure holding them together was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I looked at the room. I looked at the press corps cameras. I looked at the nobles and the staff and the ministry delegates, all of them carrying the particular expression of people who had arrived uncertain and were now being handed something shaped like certainty and were deciding whether to take it. Torvian was not in the room. I had not seen him since the sublevel. I did not know where he was, what he knew, whether Briar had reached him, whether Silas had moved, whether the 8 Omegas in the basement were still in their beds, or whether someone had already begun the process of making them harder to find. I had no rescue arriving. I had what I had read, and I had the archive document still inside my memory where nothing could remove it. I spoke before Mercer called for a response. I did not ask permission. I said, "My name is Sairen Holt and I faked a blood fever to avoid the selection because 3 candidates ahead of me had disappeared after receiving sealed marks and the office that runs the selection called it hysteria." The room did not go quiet. It went alert, which was different. Alert meant people were still deciding. I said, "Everything the minister told you is partially true. I did enter the archive without clearance. I was in the map room. I did use manufactured illness to avoid attending. Every one of those things happened. I am not going to deny them because the reasons behind them are more important than the acts themselves." I said, "This selection has been used for 14 months as a targeting system for Omegas with rare biological designations. Not to choose them, to remove them. The candidates who disappeared are alive. They are in a sublevel holding facility beneath this building accessible through the East Wing laundry corridor, 3 junctions to the interior wall. They can be found in the next 4 minutes by anyone in this room willing to walk down and look." Mercer said, "This is a fabricated account designed to redirect attention from criminal conduct." I said, "Then check the basement." He said, "There is no basement access from this building's East Wing." I said, "There is on the 1981 construction documents. The renovation sealed the entrance but did not remove the corridor. The access code currently active on the panel door is 6 digits, and it was entered by Briar Calloway this morning at 9:47. 2 delegates near the south wall looked at each other. One of them was already reaching for a communication device. Mercer's voice did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He said I was dangerous because I was persuasive. He said persuasive Omegas with rare blood designations had historically been the most effective vectors for false claims against legitimate royal authority. I said, "The sealed archive documents in Case 3 of the North Wall describe a biological authentication ritual that requires a convergence of rare blood Omega signatures. The ritual does not forge a bond. It unlocks a buried record. The record names an Omega bloodline as co-equal in royal succession. Those documents were sealed 40 years ago by the same ministry office that Mercer Kane currently runs. The room broke open. Not violently, in the way a held breath finally releases all at once, converting silence into noise and movement and the particular chaos of people whose working assumptions had just been restructured without their permission. And from beneath us, distinct and unmistakable through the old stone floor, came the sound of knocking. Rhythmic, deliberate, not 3 and 3 this time. More, many more hands all at once. Chapter 10. The floor answered before anyone in that room was ready for it. The knocking rose through the stone the way sound rises through water, everywhere at once, sourceless until it was undeniable. And then the East delegate was on his feet and already moving toward the door before Mercer could reposition his argument. 2 ministry representatives followed. Then 6 more people from the back rows, moving with the particular urgency of individuals who have just realized they are standing inside a lie they did not build and do not want to be associated with when it finishes collapsing. Mercer told his security officers to hold the court perimeter. 3 of them moved. 1 of them did not. The one who did not stepped back from his position near the south door, set his identification badge on the seat beside him and sat down. He did not explain himself. He simply removed himself from the order, quietly, with the deliberate stillness of a man who had been waiting for a specific moment to stop pretending. Silas Rook came through the east entrance 40 seconds after the delegates left. He was not armed. He was not in formal dress. He was carrying a tablet in one hand and a physical access key in the other, a key I recognized from the sublevel door panel, and his face held the expression of someone who had rehearsed a moment for a long time and was now living inside it and finding it both better and worse than the rehearsal. He walked to the center of the floor. He stood beside me without being asked. He placed the tablet face up on the stone where the court could see the screen, and on the screen was a continuous record, logged dates, logged entry times, logged biometric verifications, every visit he had made to the east sublevel over the past 9 months, and beside each entry a status log, food delivered, medical checks completed, monitoring systems adjusted to reduce sedative concentration, small interventions made consistently over 9 months to keep 8 people alive and undamaged. While he worked out how to get them out without triggering the deletion protocol Mercer had built into the holding system. Mercer said, "Silas has been operating in violation of royal security directives since last autumn. This documentation is further evidence of the coordinated operation I described." Silas said, "Mercer told me 14 months ago that the sublevel system was a voluntary protective custody arrangement for candidates who had received credible threats. He said I had ministerial authorization to oversee welfare checks. He said if I disclosed the location to anyone, including my brother, he would release evidence that my partner, a beta civilian with no palace affiliation, had accessed restricted royal medical records on my behalf to verify a personal health question. He said that access, unauthorized, would result in a 15-year federal violation for my partner and removal of his welfare credentials permanently. He said, I stayed quiet because I believed I could keep them alive longer from inside the system than I could from outside it. He said, I was wrong to believe that silence was the same as protection. He said it to the room. He said it directly. He did not soften it or redirect it or wrap it in justification. He named what he had done and what it had cost, and he let the room hold both of those things at the same time. The delegates came back. They came back faster than they had left, and they came back different. One of them was on a live communication channel with the Federal Oversight Office. One was recording. One walked directly to Mercer's position and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the court, that there were 8 individuals in the sublevel holding corridor and that medical response had been requested and that nobody was going to leave this building until a full independent investigation team had been authorized. Mercer's security officer moved toward me, the one who had kept his position. Torvian came through the west entrance. He did not move fast. He did not need to. Every alpha biological signal in the room responded to him the same way the alley wolves had responded on the morning he walked into my boarding house, by standing down, by clearing space, by recognizing something that outranked everything else present. He crossed the floor and he positioned himself beside me without touching me, without making it a display, simply by being there, present and visible, which was the only thing he had ever promised me he would be. He looked at Mercer. He said, "The federal oversight request has been filed. The welfare contract on Silas's partner has been dissolved as of 6 minutes ago. The deletion protocol on the sublevel system has been deactivated by Palace Authority." He said all of this without inflection, without triumph, as statements of completed actions rather than threats in progress. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "The girl's scent touched the royal seal when she entered this court." He said it to the room, not to either of us. He said everyone here should understand what that means before they decide which account to believe. The seal beneath my feet pulsed once. Not metaphorically. Physically, a warmth that moved from the stone through the soles of my shoes and up through my legs, and the light in the court shifted, imperceptibly but visibly, slightly warmer, slightly more present, the way light changes when something that has been switched off for a very long time is finally switched back on. The names began appearing in the surface of the stone. Not written, revealed, as if they had always been there under a layer of something that had just worn through. Names in the old script, the same archival script I had read in the sealed documents. Omega names. 30, 40, more than I could count from where I stood. The erased co-equal line written back into the place from which it had been removed. And at the bottom of the list, in letters that were still forming, still arriving as though being spoken from somewhere below the floor, Sairen Holt. Callum's voice came through the open east door. He was standing at the entrance with a medical officer beside him and 6 of the sublevel survivors behind him, and he said, "That is not possible." His voice was not afraid. It was something past fear, the sound of someone whose understanding of a situation has just been completely rebuilt from the foundation. He said, "Only deceased heirs are named by the seal after the initial bloodline sealing. The record cannot add a living name unless the suppression on that name was applied during the person's lifetime without their knowledge." The court had gone absolutely still. I looked down at the stone, at my name still forming at the bottom of the oldest record in the building. Torvian turned to look at me, not with the distance he maintained in public, not with the managed control he used when the room was watching. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in the service room on the cold floor, with everything available, with nothing held back. He said quietly, intended for me and received by the entire silent room, that he had not come to the selection to choose a candidate. He had come because something had been taken from this institution and he had intended to return it. He said, "I will not ask you to accept any title you did not choose, but I will ask you to accept that everything you felt was real, including mine." I looked at him for a long time. The court waited. The cameras ran. The seal beneath me continued its quiet light. Mercer was taken from the room by federal oversight officers who arrived through the west entrance in the silence that followed. He did not resist. He walked out with the particular posture of a man who had spent 40 years preventing a specific moment and had finally reached it anyway, and the moment was smaller than the fear he had built around it. Silas sat down heavily on the nearest bench and pressed both hands over his face and stayed that way for a long time. Callum walked across the court floor and stood beside me and did not say anything. He did not need to. I looked at the room, at the press corps still recording, at the nobles and delegates and staff who had come to watch something happen and had watched something they did not have a category for yet. I thought about the morning I had woken up with a black seal on my windowsill and decided that surviving meant staying invisible. I thought about every person in that sublevel room who had made a different calculation and lost the choice anyway. I thought about what it cost to protect yourself by shrinking, and whether the space you saved yourself into was ever actually safe or just lonelier than the danger you were avoiding. I reached out and took Torvian's hand. Not dramatically, not for the room. I took it because he was there and I had decided to stop treating presence like a threat. He closed his fingers around mine and did not say anything else. Later, after the medical teams had cleared the sublevel, after the federal investigators had sealed the ministry records, after Silas had given his full testimony and Breyer had given hers and the press had filed 17 different versions of the same story, Torvian and I sat in the recovery wing room with the 2 windows facing the garden that nobody used. He said, "The white bird is there again." I looked. It was still unidentified, still entirely unbothered by the fact of being observed. I said, Maybe it stays because it decided this place was worth staying in despite everything. He looked at me sideways. He said, maybe. The lesson was not written on the seal or spoken in the court or delivered in any of the formal language the investigation would use in its final report. The lesson was in Mercer's face as they walked him out, in the 40 years he had spent afraid of a name on a stone, in all the people he had removed to prevent a truth from surfacing that surfaced anyway the moment enough people decided to stop pretending it was not there. Systems that demand your silence in exchange for your safety are not offering safety. They are offering a smaller version of the danger, one that feels manageable because you are the one administering it to yourself. That night I stood at the window and watched the city lights of New Carthage come on one by one, and I thought about Callum saying my name from the east doorway, not afraid, just rebuilt, and I thought that surviving does not require invisibility. It requires someone willing to stay visible beside you while you figure out how to take up the space that was always yours. The seal in the court floor did not dim when the lights came on. Our team is here every week, building stories that remind you what courage actually looks like from the inside. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you needed to feel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us which moment hit hardest. Your words inspire the next person who needs to hear that they are not alone.